When Princess Anne emerged, it was supposed to be routine, a discreet arrival, a brief stop, nothing more. But when reports emerged that Prince Harry had quietly returned to London and Princess Anne's schedule shifted in ways palace watchers rarely ignore, speculation exploded. Why would the monarchy's most disciplined guardian make time now? And what happened behind closed doors that no official statement seemed eager to explain? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, there was almost nothing to notice. No formal announcement, no carefully staged appearance, no language about family unity or private reflection. Just scattered reports, fragments of timing, and a pattern that longtime royal observers claimed felt unusually controlled. According to various public interpretations and commentary circulating around royal coverage, Harry's reported return appeared designed to avoid attention rather than invite it. That debt, MIL alone, was enough to trigger questions. Because for years, public narratives surrounding Harry's relationship with the institution he once represented have rarely been quiet, and yet this time felt different. There were no dramatic headlines attached to the arrival itself, no public remarks, no immediate signs of confrontation. If anything, what stood out most was the absence of the familiar signals. The silence, the restraint, the sense that if conversations were taking place, they were happening far away from microphones and carefully outside the rhythm of ordinary royal messaging. Then attention shifted elsewhere. Observers began noting something they considered unusual. Anne's movements, not dramatic changes, not cancellations, simply moments that, in royal circles, became impossible for some commentators to ignore. The Princess Royal has long carried a reputation not for emotional gestures, but for relentless continuity. Duty before sentiment, protocol before performance, acros. I see decades of public life, she became known as the royal who rarely participates in visible family theater, which is precisely why speculation intensified. Why Anne? If there had truly been a private moment of contact or even a conversation connected to Harry's reported return, many expected different names to dominate discussion. Instead, attention moved toward the royal, often described as the institution's steady hand, the person associated less with reconciliation and more with reality. That interpretation changed the mood completely, because suddenly the story no longer sounded like a family reunion. It started sounding like something quieter, more deliberate. Royal commentators began offering competing theories, each more cautious than the last. Some framed it as administrative timing, others suggested ordinary family logistics. Still others wondered whether Anne's involvement, if there was any at all, pointed towards something deeper than emotion. Not forgiveness, not confrontation, responsibility, and responsibility inside royal life carries its own language. There are conversations meant for headlines, then there are conversations meant to protect continuity. That distinction became impossible to ignore. No palace clarification arrived to cool speculation. No spokesperson stepped forward to reshape the narrative. The silence remained intact, and with every hour that passed, public attention seemed to drift further away from the arrival itself and toward a larger question nobody could answer with confidence. What would justify a meeting now? Not after years of public distance. Not after competing versions of events. Not after so much had already been said. Unless the purpose was never about revisiting what happened before. Unless this quiet return had less to do with repairing old fractures and more to do with understanding what comes next. Because if the meeting happened at all, insiders suggest it was not designed to heal old wounds, it was meant to address something much larger. For years, Anne stayed out of public family battles. Yet behind palace walls, she has long been viewed as the stabilizer, the person trusted when emotions become liabilities. That reputation did not appear overnight. It was built slowly, almost stubbornly, across decades of public life and private restraint. While headlines often chased conflict, personality, and dramatic turning points, Anne developed an entirely different image, one rooted not in popularity, but in predictability. Not in performance, but in endurance. Among royal observers and commentators, she became associated with something increasingly rare in modern public life: consistency. And consistency carries its own kind of authority. That is why speculation surrounding any possible contact between Prince Harry and Princess Anne immediately felt different from the narratives audiences had grown used to. This was not framed through the familiar language of reconciliation, emotional breakthroughs, or pub. Now, lick repair. If such a conversation happened at all, many interpreted its significance through an entirely different lens, the language of responsibility. Because Anne has rarely occupied the role of mediator in public imagination. She has instead been portrayed as something quieter and, in some ways, more influential. The royal who continues moving regardless of turbulence. While other figures often become symbols of transition, change, or public sentiment, Anne's image has remained tied to institutional continuity. She has long appeared less interested in shaping narratives than in surviving them. That distinction matters. Royal stories are often presented as personal conflicts between individuals. But beneath those narratives sits another layer entirely: the institution itself, the schedules, the expectations, the weight of continuity. And in moments of uncertainty, commentators frequently suggest that some family members are viewed not simply as relatives, but as custodians. Anne's place, Cambridge, has often been placed into that category, which raises an uncomfortable possibility. If Harry's reported return involved conversations beyond ordinary family contact, then the symbolism changes. Speaking with Anne would not automatically represent forgiveness. It would not necessarily signal approval. It could instead represent something more difficult and more emotionally complex. Acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that some relationships inside royal life exist beyond affection. Acknowledgement that generations inherit obligations they never personally created. That idea has followed the monarchy through periods of transition before. Public faces change, expectations evolve. Yet every era eventually confronts the same question: how does continuity survive when personalities collide? Observers have increasingly returned to that question in recent years. Periods of public scrutiny, changing expectations, and shifting roles have created renewed conversations about stability inside modern monarchy. Not collapse, not crisis, but adaptation. And in those conversations, Anne's role is often described in unusually practical terms, not as the future, but as the bridge. The person who understands what existed before and what may come after. Which may explain why speculation around this moment refuses to disappear. Because if Anne's involvement carried meaning, then perhaps her role extended far beyond appearances, public engagements, or symbolic presence. Perhaps what made the possibility of such a meeting feel significant was not emotion at all. Perhaps it was authority without spectacle. And perhaps that is why so many people kept asking the same question after the reports surfaced: not what was said, but what needed to be said now. Because the conversation, according to speculation, may not have centered on the past at all, but on what happens next. London has always represented more than geography for Harry. It is memory, identity, and unfinished business. That may be why reports of a quiet return carried such unusual weight. Not because arrivals are rare, not because travel itself means anything extraordinary, but because London has never existed as a neutral place in the public story surrounding Prince Harry. Every return, every appearance, every absence has gradually become layered with meanings that extend far beyond movement. For some, it represents duty left behind. For others, it represents a connection that never fully disappeared. And somewhere between those interpretations sits the uncertainty that continues to define his relationship with royal life. Over time, public understanding of Harry's place within the monarchy transformed in ways few people could have predicted. Once positioned in popular imagination as the familiar, spare, visible, energetic, emotionally accessible, his public identity shifted into something far more complicated. Conversations became broader, expectations became sharper, personal choices began colliding with institution, all traditions in ways that created years of interpretation, disagreement, and speculation. Then came the period that changed everything: public interviews, competing narratives, personal reflections. A memoir that generated enormous discussion and reopened questions many believed had already settled into history. Supporters viewed those moments as necessary honesty. Critics saw them as deeply disruptive. Others believed both interpretations could exist at once. But whatever position people took, one thing became difficult to deny. Those years altered the emotional architecture surrounding Harry's relationship with royal life, and relationships shaped in public rarely returned to simplicity. That is why this reported visit, if interpreted symbolically, feels different to many commentators. Not dramatic enough to announce resolution, not distant enough to suggest complete separation. Instead, it occupies uncomfortable territory in between, the place where family and institution stop being, behaving like the same thing, Because royal life has always demanded distinctions that ordinary families rarely face. Personal disappointment can exist alongside constitutional expectation. Affection can survive disagreement. Distance can coexist with obligation. And perhaps that is what gives this moment its unusual emotional tension. If Harry returned quietly, observers continue asking the same question. What was the purpose of removing attention rather than attracting it? Was it practical? Was it personal? Or was it something harder to define? Some interpretations suggest there are moments when public narratives become too large and conversations become too consequential to unfold publicly. Other voices caution against reading too much into ordinary events, but uncertainty itself has become part of the story. Because uncertainty leaves space. Space for hope. Space for suspicion. Space for the possibility that not every return is about reclaiming something lost. Maybe some returns are about understanding what still remains. That possibility changes the emotional stakes completely, because this no longer becomes a question of who was right or wrong in previous chapters. It becomes something quieter and potentially more difficult, a question of whether identity, built outside the institution, can ever fully separate itself from identity shaped inside it. And if that question was present in any private reflection surrounding this moment, then emotion alone would never have been enough to answer it. Which may explain why attention kept returning to one figure. Not because she is the loudest voice, not because she is viewed as sentimental, but because her reputation has long been connected to something else entirely. Yet Anne's reported response, according to royal commentary circles, was said to be measured, not emotional. No cameras, no balcony appearance, no statement. Sometimes silence becomes the loudest headline of all, and that may be why the speculations surrounding the moment refused to disappear. Because if there was a meeting, if a quiet return led to a private exchange, then what captured attention was never the possibility of dramatic words being spoken. It was the absence of everything people expected to see. No public display of warmth, no carefully managed signals, no symbolic choreography, just silence. And the strange weight silence seems to carry whenever royal life moves out of public view. For many observers, that silence became the story, not because it confirmed anything, but because it created space for interpretation. Royal life has always operated on two levels at once. There is the public version of the speeches, appearances, ceremonies, carefully chosen language. Then there is the quieter layer, where meaning is often assigned not through declarations but through restraint, through timing, through who meets whom, through who does not speak afterward. And if Anne's name became attached to this moment in public discussion, many believe that detail changed the atmosphere completely. Because Anne's public identity has rarely been associated with dramatic reconciliation. She is more often framed as someone who absorbs emotion rather than performs it. That distinction matters. If people imagined what such a conversation could have looked like, commentary circles repeatedly returned to the same interpretation, not confrontation, not emotional repair, but controlled attention. A conversation where listening carried more significance than persuasion. A setting where no one needed to win. Because some conversations inside families are about feelings. Others are about consequences. And within public institutions, the line between those two can become impossible to separate. That possibility created a quieter kind of tension. If Harry arrived carrying years of public interpretation, and Anne represented continuity and institutional memory, then the symbolic contrast became difficult to ignore. One figure often discussed through personal experience, the other associated with discipline and endurance. Neither role exists without pressure, neither escapes expectation, which raises another uncomfortable question. When relationships become public narratives, is reconciliation even the right word anymore, or does something else eventually take its place? Trust. Trust not as emotion, but as structure. Trust not as agreement, but as predictability. That is where public speculations seem to settle. Not on whether old disagreements disappeared. Not on whether everyone suddenly understood each other. But on whether roles could still exist despite distance. Whether family identity and institutional identity could remain connected even after years of visible strain. And perhaps that is why Anne's imagined role in this story continued attracting attention. Not because people expected her to negotiate, but because people expected her to listen, to weigh, to separate what belonged to history and what belonged to the future. That expectation alone reveals something deeper about how she is perceived. the stabilizer, not the bridge back, not the architect of emotional closure. Simply the person trusted to remain steady while everyone else searches for meaning. And if that interpretation contains even a fraction of truth, then the most important part of any private exchange may not have been what was said. It may have been what remained unsaid. Because silence can protect, silence can delay. But silence also creates room for questions that continue growing long after doors close. And private conversations inside royal life rarely stay private for long. The most revealing detail may not have been who met, but who stayed silent afterward. Because in royal life, silence is rarely empty. After reports and speculation began circulating around the possibility of a quiet moment connected to Prince Harry and renewed attention on Princess Anne, many people expected a familiar pattern. A carefully worded clarificati, a brief denial, a line designed to redirect attention and close the story before it expanded. Instead, according to public observation, none of those signals arrived in any meaningful way, and that absence became its own event. Because official silence creates a strange effect. It does not confirm. It does not reject. It simply leaves space, and public imagination has never been comfortable with empty space. Royal commentary circles understand this dynamic well. Over time, audiences have become trained to look not only at statements but at the lack of statements. Not only at appearances but absences. People study timing. They compare schedules. They examine language. They search for meaning inside details that may mean everything or nothing at all. That tension began shaping the reaction. Some commentators urged caution, suggesting ordinary family interactions should not automatically become institutional narratives. Others argued that when public figures tied so closely to national symbolism move quietly, interpretation becomes unavoidable. Neither position fully displaced the other. Instead, both ideas existed side by side, and that coexistence revealed something deeper. People were not simply asking whether a meeting happened. They were asking what silence means inside modern monarchy. Because public understanding of royal life has changed. Once, distance created authority. Now, distance often creates questions. Yet the institution itself still tends to operate according to older instincts: control through patience, communication through restraint, and the belief that not every moment deserves public explanation. That contrast became impossible to ignore. Outside the institution, speculation accelerated. Inside the public imagination, theories multiplied. But institutionally, nothing appeared to move. No visible shift in roles, no announced changes. No public gestures that suggested some dramatic turning point had quietly unfolded behind closed doors. If anything, nothing happened at all. The external structure remained intact, and perhaps that detail mattered more than anything else. Because there is a difference between emotional significance and formal significance. A private conversation can matter deeply without changing policy. A moment can carry meaning without becoming history. That possibility introduced a quieter interpretation, one that received less attention but lingered beneath the louder headlines. What if nothing formal changed? What if no agreement emerged? What if the importance of the moment existed only in the fact that contact, reflection, or acknowledgement occurred at all? That interpretation lacks spectacle, but it carries emotional weight, because institutions survive through continuity, while families often survive through moments that never become public. And perhaps that is why reactions remain so divided. Some saw silence as evidence something important happened. Others saw silence as evidence that nothing happened at all. Yet history suggests those two ideas are not always opposites. Sometimes the moments remembered most are not the ones announced from balconies or described in official language. Sometimes they are the ones that leave no visible trace at all. Still, royal history suggests symbolic moments often matter more than announcements. Every private royal meeting eventually points toward one unavoidable question. What does this mean for the future? That question arrives quietly at first. It rarely appears in official language. It is not written into schedules or spoken from podiums. But whenever public attention turns toward private moments inside royal life, the conversation almost always expands beyond personalities and moves toward something larger: continuity. And that is where the atmosphere surrounding this story becomes more complicated. Because even when public interest focuses on individuals, monarchy has always encouraged people to think in generations. If reports, interpretations, and Mass speculation surrounding this quiet moment carried unusual intensity. It may be because people instinctively understood that conversations inside the royal family are rarely interpreted as belonging only to the present. They become symbols. They become projections. They become questions about direction. Not what happened. What happens next? That shift changes everything. The discussion stops being about whether distance can be repaired and becomes something broader. What role distance itself plays inside an institution built on continuity. For years, public narratives surrounding Prince Harry have often been framed through departure, reinvention, and separation from established expectations. But public imagination rarely leaves those stories there. Every development eventually circles back to the same idea, whether separation from royal life means separation from royal identity. And that is not a simple question, because identity inside monarchy has always existed in layers. There is the personal layer, family history, shared memories, private relationships. Then there is the institutional layer, duty, succession, continuity. Those layers overlap until people stop knowing where one ends and the other begins, which brings attention inevitably toward Prince William, not because there is any public indication of involvement in this specific moment, but because public conversations about the future of the monarchy almost always become conversations about symbolic positions. William occupies a place inside those discussions that carries unusual weight. To many observers, he represents the visible future of continuity, not simply another family member, but the next chapter people instinctively imagine when they think about long-term stability. That symbolic role changes how moments like this are interpreted. If family members reconnect privately, people ask whether it affects the institution. If nothing changes publicly, people wonder whether private understanding still matters. If silence remains, people search for hidden meaning. And slowly, without anyone declaring it directly, ordinary human questions become constitutional questions. That transformation creates pressure no public statement can fully resolve. Because families often seek understanding, institutions seek endurance, and royal life, fairly or unfairly, is expected to satisfy both. Perhaps that is why reactions remain so emotionally divided. Some people look at moments like these and hope for reconciliation. Others focus on boundaries, structure, and preserving roles. Neither perspective fully replaces the other. They simply exist together, creating tension between emotion and expectation. But there may be another way to understand it. Maybe the significance of moments like this is not measured by headlines, announcements, or immediate outcomes. Maybe their value exists somewhere quieter, in acknowledgement, in restraint, in the recognition that history does not always move through drama, tick declarations. Sometimes it moves through private moments nobody fully understands until years later. And if that possibility exists here, then perhaps the real story was never about changing the present overnight. It was about reminding everyone that legacy has always been larger than any single chapter. But perhaps the most important answer was never spoken publicly. Princess Anne's reputation was never built on speeches, it was built on consistency. That may be why her presence inside this story, whether symbolic, practical, or simply amplified through public interpretation, continued to attract attention long after the initial speculation faded. Because consistency has become one of the rarest forms of influence in modern public life. It does not trend. It does not dominate headlines. It simply remains. And remaining is harder than it sounds. Over decades, Princess Anne came to represent something that exists in quiet contrast to the way public narratives usually work. Royal estate. Nation often moves toward milestones, celebrations, tensions, departures, and dramatic turning points. But Anne's public image was shaped in the spaces between those moments. Duty repeated until it became identity. Responsibility performed without expecting applause. That reputation creates expectations of its own. Because people often mistake restraint for distance. But restraint and distance are not always the same thing. Restraint can sometimes mean carrying obligations without making them visible. And perhaps that idea sits at the center of why this moment resonated with so many people. If there was any private reflection behind the reports and speculation, public imagination seemed to return again and again to the same possibility, not that Anne offered solutions, but that she represented perspective. Perspective built across changing eras. Perspective shaped by watching personalities evolve while institutions continued. perspective that understands something difficult. Royal life ICR emerged often rewards continuity while demanding personal sacrifice. That tension is rarely discussed directly. People see ceremonies, they see appearances, they see public roles. But behind every enduring public identity sits a quieter reality, the cost of being expected to remain steady while circumstances change around you. That cost may not always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like restraint. Sometimes it looks like choosing silence. Sometimes it means accepting that service will never produce the emotional clarity people expect. And perhaps that is where this story became larger than one reported meeting. Because suddenly the conversation no longer centered only on reconciliation or disagreement. It became about what responsibility means when public roles and private relationships stop moving at the same speed. For years, public discussion surrounding Prince Harry often focused on departure, reinvention, and the search for identity outside established expectations. Anne's public image, MISADF'd in almost the opposite direction: continuity, endurance, remaining inside structures even when they become difficult. Neither path appears simple, neither appears painless, and perhaps that contrast explains why so many people projected meaning onto this moment. Not because anyone expected ultimatums, not because anyone expected dramatic resolutions, but because people wondered whether there are lessons that only time teaches. Lessons about distance, about identity, about understanding that service and freedom each carry their own forms of sacrifice. If Anne represents anything in public imagination, perhaps it is not obedience. Perhaps it is endurance. The belief that not every chapter needs immediate resolution. That not every disagreement must end with declarations. That some questions are allowed to remain unfinished while people continue moving forward. And maybe that is why the silence surrounding this story still feels strangely significant. Not because silence guarantees me meaning, but because sometimes silence leaves room for people to decide what matters most, which leads to one final uncertainty that refuses to disappear. And that leaves one final question: did anything actually change? Perhaps the significance was never in whether the meeting happened exactly as described, but in why people wanted to believe it did. Because by the time stories like this reach public imagination, they are rarely about schedules, locations, or private conversations anymore. They become something else. They become reflections of larger hopes, larger anxieties, and larger questions people quietly carry about family, change, and whether distance can ever truly become permanent. That may explain why this moment seemed to linger, not because anyone could point to a dramatic announcement, not because roles changed overnight, not because some hidden agreement emerged behind closed doors, but because stories surrounding royalty have always existed in a space between reality and symbolism, and people often search those stories for answers that extend far beyond the individuals involved. Over time, public discussion surrounding Prince Harry became tied to ideas larger than one-person departure, identity, independence, belonging. In a different way, public perceptions surrounding Princess Anne came to represent continuity, discipline, and the quieter side of institutional life. When those symbols appear to move closer together, even briefly, people notice. And perhaps that reaction says as much about the audience as it does about the story itself. Because reconciliation has become one of the most powerful narratives in public life. People want to believe old divisions can soften. They want to believe complicated histories can evolve. They want to believe private understanding remains possible even after years of public distance. But reconciliation itself is not always simple. Sometimes it looks dramatic. Sometimes it changes everything. And sometimes it changes absolutely. Lately nothing on the surface while quietly changing how people think. That possibility feels especially powerful inside institutions built on continuity. Because monarchy has always carried two stories at once. The story of individuals, and the story of something expected to outlast individuals. Those stories overlap, but they are not identical. Families can forgive. Institutions continue. People leave. Structures remain. And yet, even within those structures, moments of humanity continue to attract attention because they remind people that behind titles, expectations, and public roles are relationships that remain impossible to fully explain from the outside. That may be why private moments generate such fascination, not because people expect access, but because uncertainty invites imagination. A quiet return becomes symbolic, a lack of comment becomes meaningful, An ordinary interaction becomes interpreted as history, and over time, nobody can fully separate what happened from what when people hoped happened. Maybe that is unavoidable. Maybe public stories have always worked this way. Or maybe moments like this endure because they refuse to offer easy conclusions. Because certainty closes a story. Ambiguity keeps it alive. So perhaps the most honest ending is not one built on declarations of healing or predictions of change. Perhaps the quieter possibility matters more. That people can remain connected without returning to old versions of themselves. That understanding does not always require agreement. That time changes relationships even when institutions remain unchanged. And that not every meaningful chapter announces itself while it is happening. Whether this moment represented reflection, acknowledgement, coincidence, or simply the public searching for meaning where none was intended, one thing seems certain. The fascination surrounding it was never only about one reported meeting. It was about legacy. It was about memory. It was about what people believe families owe one another, even after distance. Whether it was a turning point or simply another quiet chapter in a complicated family story, the silence afterward may become the detail remembered longest. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.